My son was buried on the Thursday. The ground was frozen and they'd had to work to break it open. I remember thinking that even the earth didn't want to let him go. I stood at the graveside in my good coat, the one Caroline had picked out for me 3 Christmases ago, and I held it together. That's what fathers do. That's what I've always done. You hold it together so everyone else around you can fall apart. My daughter-in-law, Renee, no? Wait. Let me start over. Her name was Gwen, my son's wife. They'd been married 6 years, and in all that time, I'd never once felt easy around her. Not in the way you feel uneasy around someone who's rude or cruel. More the way you feel uneasy when a door doesn't quite hang right on its hinges. Everything looks fine, but something's off, and you can't stop noticing it. My son's name was Joel. He was 41 years old. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings and made the best smoked brisket in the county and called me every Sunday at noon without fail. Has called me, I should say. That's the part I still trip over. The past tense of him. Joel died in October. A cardiac event, the doctor said. Sudden. No warning. He'd had a routine checkup just 4 months earlier and everything came back clean. 41 years old, in good shape, no family history. The kind of thing that makes you question everything you thought you knew about how the world works. I moved in with them 8 months before he died. My hip had given me trouble after a fall, and Joel insisted, Dad, just come stay with us while you get back on your feet. That was Joel, always the one opening the door wider. The house had a guest suite on the ground floor. Their house, technically, though it sat on 12 acres that had been in my family since my grandfather broke ground there in 1951. I transferred the deed to Joel when he and Gwen got married. A wedding gift of sorts, because I believed in them, because he was my son and I wanted him to have something solid under him. I should have been more careful about what I believed in. The day they put Joel in the ground, people came back to the house afterward. Casseroles and quiet voices, and the particular kind of grief that fills the room but nobody mentions. I was standing by the kitchen window, watching the bare tree line, when Gwen appeared at my elbow. She didn't touch me. She didn't offer me a drink of water or ask if I needed to sit down. She just stood there for a moment, and then she said very quietly, I've been meaning to talk to you about the living situation. I turned and looked at her. I think it would be best, she said, if you started making other arrangements. I'd say you have about 60 days. That's more than fair. Then she walked away, back into the room full of people who had come to mourn her husband. I stood there holding a coffee cup I didn't remember picking up. Through the window, the tree line blurred and then came back into focus. I thought about my grandfather planting those elms along the fence in 1958 because he wanted something his grandchildren could look at. I thought about Joel, 12 years old, learning to drive a tractor on that land. I thought about the fact that the woman who had just told me to leave was wearing my son's ring on her hand, and my son was in the ground not 4 hours. I set the coffee cup down on the counter. All right, I said, to no one in particular. All right. What Gwen didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd already been to see a lawyer. His name was Aldous Crane. I'd found him through a friend of mine at the Rotary Club, a retired judge who told me Aldous was the sharpest estate attorney in the state and that if I ever had a problem I couldn't solve myself, he was the man to call. I'd met with Aldous 6 weeks before Joel died. Not because I expected Joel to die. I want to be clear about that. I met with Aldous because of what I'd seen over the preceding months, living in that house. Because of the things I'd noticed that I couldn't quite unnotice. It started small. Joel had always been careful with money. Not tight, but deliberate. He kept a budget the way some men keep a garden, tending to it regularly, knowing where everything was. But that spring, he started making offhand comments. He'd mention a bill they'd had to push back or say something vague about a project at work falling through. Joel was a civil engineer. Projects didn't just fall through for Joel. He was the kind of man who anticipated problems before they arrived. Then there was the insurance. I overheard a phone call not on purpose. I was coming down the hall, and I heard Gwen on the phone with someone talking about a policy. The words I caught were double indemnity and how soon. I told myself I'd misheard. I told myself I was being the kind of suspicious old man that nobody wants to become. But I didn't stop listening. The man she was talking to. I found out later his name was Troy, and he'd been in the picture for at least 2 years, was a contractor. Did some work on properties in the area. Good looking, from what I gathered, and not shy about spending money that wasn't his. By the time I got to Aldous Crane's office, I had written down 8 things I'd seen or heard that I couldn't explain away. I slid that list across his desk and watched him read it without expression. When he looked up, he said, "How long ago did you transfer the deed?" I told him. He said, "And the property is in your son's name alone?" "Joint tenancy," I said. "Joel and Gwen?" Aldous tapped the list with 2 fingers. "Then if something were to happen to your son, she would inherit his half and become the sole owner." "I know," I said. "And you want to do something about that before something happens." "I want to protect the land," I said. "Whatever else happens, I want to protect the land." Aldous leaned back and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." What we did was not complicated, but it required Joel. I had to tell my son what I suspected, and that was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than standing at his graveside, in a way, because at least at the graveside the truth was already out. Sitting across from my son in a booth at the diner where we'd been having breakfast together since he was old enough to order for himself, that was something else entirely. He didn't believe me at first. That's the honest truth. He sat there and he looked at me with those eyes of his that were so much like his mother's eyes, and he said, "Dad, Gwen wouldn't." I said, "Maybe not, but humor me." He was quiet for a long time. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the parking lot. And then he said, "She's been different lately. I've noticed it too. I just didn't want to." He stopped. He shook his head. "I didn't want to see it." I told him about Troy. I told him what I'd heard on the phone. I watched my son sit very still while I said the words, the way a man will go still when something lands that he's been trying not to know. When I was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to put the land in a trust," I said. "A conservation trust. Take it off the table entirely. Neither of us could sell it. Neither of us could lose it in a judgment. It just exists, the way it's always existed." Joe looked at me. "She'd fight it." "She'd have to fight a conservation easement backed by the county land board," I said. "Aldous says it's bulletproof." Something passed across my son's face. Something that looked like grief, except the grief came too early, before there was anything to grieve. Like he already knew how the story was going to end and was trying to make peace with it. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." We signed the paperwork 3 weeks later. The Harmon Family Conservation Trust, named for my grandfather Earl Harmon, who broke that ground in 1951. 12 acres of hardwood forest and pasture, and the old creek that my son used to fish in as a boy. Placed in conservation easement with the county. No development, no sale, in perpetuity. Gwen was at a conference in Nashville that weekend. She never knew. 46 days after I told Gwen, "All right," I called a moving company and had my things taken to my brother-in-law's place 2 towns over. I didn't fight about it. I didn't explain myself. I thanked her for the time in the house, and I meant it, oddly enough, because that time had taught me everything I needed to know, and I drove away. I want you to understand something about those 46 days. People ask me how I kept quiet that long, how I smiled at Sunday dinners and nodded when Gwen talked about eventually selling and moving somewhere with more opportunity. How I sat across the table from her and listened to her make plans for land she didn't own and never would. Here's the truth. I thought about Joel. Every single day I thought about Joel. Not the version of Joel who died, though I thought about him too, but the version of Joel who sat across from me in that diner booth and said, "Okay, let's do it." The version who had chosen to protect something even when it cost him something. I held on to that. I also thought about what Aldous had said when I'd called in the morning after the funeral. He'd said, "I need you to be patient a little longer. We're not done." Because while I've been packing my boxes, Aldous had been talking to the county sheriff's office. Not about the land. The land was handled. About the insurance policy. The one Gwen had taken out on Joel 14 months before he died, in an amount that made the sheriff's detective sit up very straight when Aldous laid the documentation on his desk. I didn't know the details then. I only knew that Aldous had told me to be patient, and I have learned in 64 years of living that the best thing you can do when someone smarter than you tells you to wait is to wait. I was at my brother-in-law's house eating cereal at his kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in December when my phone rang. It was Aldous. He said, "They went to the house this morning." I put down my spoon. "She's been arrested. She's Troy as well. The toxicology report came back last week, and the DA's office moved fast." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, my brother-in-law's bird feeder was swinging in the wind and a cardinal was trying to land on it. I watched the cardinal try 3 times before it caught hold. The land, I said. Can't be touched, Aldous said. She's entitled to nothing from the estate once the fraud charges are established, and the Conservation Trust is ironclad regardless. The County Land Board will hold it in perpetuity. I thanked him. I hung up the phone. I sat there and I watched that cardinal eat its breakfast, and I thought about my son, and I thought about my grandfather, and I thought about 12 acres of hardwood forest with a creek running through it where a boy once caught his first catfish on a Sunday afternoon in June. There's a lot people want to know when I tell this story. They want to know about Gwen, about Troy, about what happened in the courtroom, and what the sentences were and whether they showed any remorse. I understand that. I have my own feelings about all of it. But that's not what I want to spend the rest of this telling on. What I want to tell you is this. Gwen's attorney tried in the early stages to challenge the Conservation Trust. It took 2 hearings and about 3 weeks before her legal team figured out that there was nothing to challenge. The trust had been established before Joel died, with Joel's full knowledge and consent, witnessed and notarized, and filed with the county in accordance with every applicable statute. The easement was registered. The land board had already sent their surveyor. Gwen could no more sell that property than she could sell a public park. I heard she cried when her attorney told her. I don't know if that's true. I don't spend much time thinking about it. What I spend time thinking about is the summer, which is still a few months off, but already feels closer than it did. My brother-in-law has a spare room that he keeps insisting is mine for as long as I want it. But I've started having a different kind of conversation. With the county land board, with a small foundation that funds nature education programs, with an architect friend of mine who builds modest things that last. Because 12 acres, with a creek running through them, set aside forever from development, doesn't have to just sit there. It can be something. A trail, a picnic shelter maybe, a place where kids from the county can come learn what a watershed is, how to identify a white oak, why a creek matters. A place with a plaque near the entrance that says Harmon Family Land, established 1951, conserved in memory of Joel Harmon, 1983 to 1224. That's not finished yet. There are permits and meetings and a fundraising campaign that my brother-in-law's daughter is helping me run out of her living room. But it's moving. Things are moving. Joel used to say that the best revenge was a life well lived. He picked that up somewhere, a book maybe, or something his mother said to him. And he carried it around with him the way certain people carry certain phrases, like a pocket stone they reach for without thinking. I used to smile when he said it. A little indulgent, the way you smile at something that sounds wise but feels too tidy for the real world. I don't smile like that anymore. I understand it now in a way I didn't before. The life well lived isn't about showing anyone anything. It's about what you tend to when nobody's watching. The deed you sign on a Saturday morning when your daughter-in-law is in Nashville. The conversation you have with your son in a diner booth when you'd rather say nothing at all. The ends along the fence line that your grandfather planted in 1958 so his grandchildren would have something to look at. They're still there. I drove past last week. The county owns the easement now, but the trees don't know that. They just keep doing what elms do, growing up and growing wide and holding their ground through whatever winter comes. I think Joel would have liked knowing that. I think he does know it, wherever he is. And that's enough for me. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the legal part, not the paperwork, but the deeper current underneath all of it. The cause and the effect. The choices people made and where those choices landed them. Gwen made a calculation. She looked at an old man with a bad hip and decided he was a problem to be managed, not a person to be reckoned with. That's the thing about people who move through the world that way. They see what's in front of them and they stop there. She saw a deed. She saw an insurance policy. She saw a 64-year-old man standing at his son's graveside and she thought, easy. She never asked what I knew. She never considered that I might have been watching just as carefully as she was. That blindness cost her everything. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's the truest thing I can tell you about how this whole situation unfolded. The outcome wasn't luck. It wasn't fate in any mystical sense. It was the direct result of what each person chose to do when nobody was requiring them to do anything at all. Joel chose to listen to a conversation he didn't want to have in a diner booth on a Tuesday morning, when it would have been so much easier to tell me I was imagining things. That took something. A kind of honesty that's harder than it sounds, especially when the truth is about someone you love. He looked at what I laid out in front of him, and he chose to see it clearly instead of comfortably. That's not a small thing. That is, I'd argued the whole thing. And then he acted on what he saw. He signed papers that protected something beyond his own immediate interests. He thought about the land, about his grandfather, about what endures after a person is gone. That kind of thinking, long and careful and pointed towards something larger than yourself. That's what separates the people who get through hard times from the people who get flattened by them. As for me, I won't pretend I handled everything gracefully. There were nights in my brother in law's spare room when I lay awake and felt nothing but raw grief. For Joel, for the years I'd spent building something I thought I understood, for the version of my family I'd had to revise. Grief doesn't care how right you were, it shows up anyway. But I kept going. I made the calls. I sat in Ardis's office and I told the truth even when it felt disloyal to say those words out loud about someone my son had chosen to marry. I moved my boxes out without a scene because I understood that the fight worth having was not the one in the driveway. Endurance isn't glamorous. It doesn't look like strength from the outside. It mostly looks like an old man eating cereal alone at a kitchen table waiting for a phone call. The phone call came. What I want anyone who hears this story to take away is not the legal strategy or the particulars of a conservation trust. Those details belong to the story. What belongs to every story, every version of this kind of moment that any person will face in their life, is the question of what you do when you have every reason to act badly and you choose not to. When you have every reason to collapse and you don't, when the easier path is right there and you take the harder one anyway, because you know, in the place where you don't lie to yourself, that it's the right one. That choice is always available, in every situation, to every person. Joel made it. I tried to make it. And 12 acres of hardwood forest with a creek running through it will carry his name forward because of it. That creek doesn't know any of this, of course. It just keeps moving. I find that comforting.